Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to St Andrews on the Terrace. I'd like to invite Sir Lloyd Gearing to introduce Geoff King.
Good afternoon, everyone. Living with uncertainty. First, we looked at geological uncertainty, then spiritual uncertainty, economic uncertainty, and now social uncertainty. But what is social uncertainty? It depends upon what you think society is. Well, Margaret Thatcher once made the remark, there's no such thing as society, in which case there couldn't be anything like social uncertainty. That remark was probably the silliest thing she ever said. She was thinking that society was no more than a crowd of people watching a football match. Certainly that is not a society. It's just a collection of people who have come together for an hour and a half with one common thing in mind. A society certainly is invisible in one sense because it consists of a complex set of relationships which link people together in all sorts of ways. And without that linking, we couldn't live. We humans have only survived to this point simply because we are a society who assist one another and on whom we depend for our very existence. So, if a human society encounters a tremendous disaster like an earthquake, it is really shaken to the foundations because all the relationships which keep it alive as our nervous system keeps us alive are interfered with, at least for a time. Now, we've invited someone who is very well prepared to talk about this subject. Dr. Geoff King is a Presbyterian minister who, first of all, has academic degrees in a wide variety of subjects: foreign languages, theology, economics. But he's particularly interested in people and in personal relationships, and has a postgraduate degree in counselling. What is more, he is minister of Knox Church, Christchurch. And if you've been down there recently and have gone to that corner on which it stands, you'll see there's a very big hole in that church, particularly in one wall. And obviously, the congregation can't use that at the moment. And so he is not only concerned with what you do with buildings, but he's also been concerned with how you keep a congregation together and how it plays its role in the larger Christchurch society, which is going through a tremendous amount of trauma. Now, with that background, I have great pleasure in inviting Dr. Geoff King to address us.
Thank you, Lord. Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kaka, ka tangi hoki a hau ti he mauri ora. E tēnei whare karakia e tu nei, tēnā koe. E ngā mate, haere, haere, haere ki te pō. E ngā manuhiri, kua tai mai nei ki te kōrerorero, ki te whakarongo, ki te ako, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. The mutton bird and the kaka cry, and I cry out also to salute the breath of life in us all. I greet this house of prayer. I acknowledge and honour our dead. I greet the visitors, of whom I'm one, who've come here to discuss, to listen and to learn. Ko Geoff King, tako ingoa. Ko te mata, tako mangwa. Ko te tuki tuki, toko awa. Ko te James Lister, toko waka. Ko Ngāti Kotimana, te iwi. Ko Ngāti Presbyteriana, te hapu. My name is Geoff King. Te Mata Peak is my mountain in Hawke's Bay. The Tuki Tuki is my river. And my Scottish Presbyterian forebears came here on the James Lister back in 1866. Now, not long after his arrival in this country, my paternal great-great-grandfather, Thomas King, married the daughter of the Reverend William Stewart McGowan at the Knox church manse in Lower Hutt, and then saw the light move to the South Island, to the mainland, where their children were born, which makes me a fourth-generation New Zealander of European descent on my father's side. I'm also, to my knowledge, the only descendant of Thomas King and Mary McGowan to become a Presbyterian minister. And I can only begin to imagine how dismayed my staunchly Calvinist forebears would be that I now find myself increasingly, in theological terms, on the margins of that denomination, and would probably prefer to call myself these days an inclusive, progressive follower of Jesus than to link myself with an institutional church. So, that being said, why, you may be asking, did I begin by addressing you in Te Reo Māori? And what does the traditional form of the mihi have to do with our subject today? Well, my reasons are quite simple. I'm not a fluent speaker of the Māori language, but I belong to a generation that has lived through a renaissance of Maori language and culture. And I think this renaissance has had an impact upon all New Zealanders of my age group and younger when it comes to describing who we think we are. We look at the world, I believe, through eyes that have been opened to more than one culturally conditioned mode of seeing. We see ourselves and others refracted through the lens of a growing self-awareness as people of the Pacific, rather than simply Europeans who've transplanted their culture somewhat farther south. And I also began at Te Reo Māori because, although it's not my native tongue, engaging with Māori language and culture has become an important part of my own social identity. Additionally, I did this because the traditional form of the mihi, in which the speaker identifies him or herself in relation to a tribe, a canoe, a river, a mountain, that form of identification is itself, in a way, an answer to the question of how one lives in uncertain times. One lives with uncertainty by reminding oneself of those things which are still certain, one's sense of belonging to a place and a people. When life's storms strip the leaves from the branches, it pays to pay attention to the roots. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm here today, thanks to the generosity of the St Andrew's Trust, to explore with you this question. How do we live with social uncertainty? Or to put the same question somewhat differently, as Sir Lloyd did, when the foundations of our lives are shaken, what on earth are we supposed to do? Now, on this day, this exact day 11 years ago, the foundations of our lives were profoundly shaken by events unfolding half a world away. And like the assassination of JFK or Diana's death in the depths of a Parisian tunnel, the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers of New York's World Trade Center were an event of such monumental significance that most people who witnessed them can still remember, I suspect, quite vividly what they were doing at the time. Can I have a show of hands? Can we still recall? Right, my point. I had just returned from a 4-month tour of duty in East Timor as a chaplain to New Zealand's 4th Battalion Group of Peacekeeping Forces. And I was, at the time this happened, trying to reconnect with my family in the idyllic surroundings of Hanna Springs. Whilst idly preparing a late breakfast, I turned on the television. Initially, I thought I was watching a movie. How many else had that feeling? It was so unreal. Only gradually did the reality of what I was seeing begin to seep through to my consciousness. I remember thinking quite consciously at that point, after this, everything is going to be different. Nothing that we've ever known before is going to be the same. Now, it is of course possible that the strength of my reaction to 9/11 was heightened by my recent experience in East Timor, which had brought home to me the fragility of human society and the speed with which social structures can be destroyed by acts of terror and war. Of course, at that stage I had no idea that within a decade I would be witnessing scenes of similar destruction in my own country, albeit with a very different cause. That is the outside shell of the building in which our congregation once worshipped from the Victoria Street side. That's the inside of the church immediately following the February earthquake. Most of the walls, fortunately, fell inwards. That's what remains of the pipe organ, which organ fans will be pleased to know has been removed and is in storage in Timaru awaiting restoration, as are the pews in a storage container outside. And that's what it looks like more or less from the outside now. Now, I intend to draw on my experiences in pre-democracy East Timor and in post-earthquake Christchurch in grappling with this question of how we live within social uncertainty today. I was saying to Margie beforehand, I'm acutely aware in tackling this subject that I am not trained in political science, nor am I a sociologist, nor an anthropologist. My academic background, as Sir Lloyd mentioned, lies in the field of languages, history and economics. My current areas of research and study are psychology and counselling, and so it's on those disciplines that I intend to draw, as well as reflecting on what I've heard and seen. Any students of economics here will know, and church history for that matter, will know the importance of defining your terms and stating clearly your assumptions. And so without further ado, I want to outline what I understand this term, social uncertainty, to mean. Social is defined by the Oxford Online Dictionary as relating to society or its organisation. Uncertainty, fairly simply, is defined by the same source as the state of being uncertain, no surprises there, which is in turn understood as not able to be relied upon, this is significant, and not definite or known. Now for my assumptions. First, a good dose of Aristotelian logic. Human beings are social animals, from Aristotle's Politics. Now, with no disrespect to those who pursue a monastic lifestyle for religious or other reasons, one of the defining characteristics of Homo sapiens sapiens is our inherent need to congregate, to form community, which is of course a loaded term, about which more will be said later. For me, however, this whole concept is very neatly encapsulated in Martin Buber's relational paradigm, I, thou, ich, du. We are social, relational beings. For now, let's move on to number 2. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity of rights. Where have we seen that before? That's not original, is it? That's from, of course, the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Essentially, I'm aware that this is a value judgment, but it's one I happen to be willing to defend, and it's one that I imagine many, if not most of you, would be willing to defend with me. So now to our third assumption. Also a value judgment, that not all forms of human society promote or nurture human freedom and equality. Back in 2008, I purchased the updated edition of 50 Facts That Should Change the World. I did this in order that I could responsibly discuss some of the big issues facing our planet with the members of our combined youth group. Why did I do that? Because I believe our young people, and not just our young people, need to know facts like these. Children living in poverty are 3 times more likely to suffer mental illness than children living in wealthy families. There are at least 27 million people around the world living in slavery of one form or another, and in more than 70 countries, same-sex relationships are still illegal. In 9 of those, this so-called crime carries the penalty of death. Statistics like these, I believe, should cause people to question and change the forms of social organisation and disorganisation that make these statistics possible. Again, of course, I am making a value judgment and getting a little bit ahead of myself. So my fourth assumption. Also a value judgment, grounded unashamedly in my understanding of the Judeo-Christian tradition and found in other religious and spiritual traditions as well. That is, that societies are to be measured not just in terms of the wealth of those who have the most, but also in terms of the well-being of those who have the least. Now, I happen to think that there are compelling pragmatic as well as ideological reasons for making and acting on this assumption. At the macro level, a situation in which 1 in 5 of the world's population goes hungry each day, whilst the richest 2% of the world's adult population owns more than half of the global household wealth, that kind of situation is simply not sustainable. Putting it simplistically, the hungry are very often also homeless. And homeless, hungry people have much to fight for and very little to lose. Now, at the micro level, I'm intrigued by the adoption of the so-called triple bottom line approach by growing numbers of businesses in this country and elsewhere, recognising that caring for people and for the planet is as important as profit if we want there to be a future that's worth having on this earth. Now, speaking of earth, I am reminded, as we've all been, that the first lecture in this 4-part series was on the subject of geological uncertainty. And we've, of course, in Christchurch experienced that at first hand. And I imagine the rest of the country's probably grown thoroughly sick and tired of hearing about our woes a bit further down south. So then, as if in sympathy, in August, Mount Tongariro burst back into action. And suddenly, everybody who calls Aotearoa New Zealand home was forcibly reminded that the crust of earth on which we stand is in places incredibly thin. The foundations of all of our existence have quite literally been shaken, and not just by increased seismicity. And this is pointed out by one of my former professors in an opinion piece printed at the beginning of this year in the Otago Daily Times. After noting that Paul Tillich's groundbreaking work, The Shaking of the Foundations, was required reading for students of theology some 50 years ago in Edinburgh, Peter Matheson in this article went on to note the relevance of this book's title to the whole spectrum of contemporary human experience, some of which has been covered by the other 3 speakers in this lecture series, of which I feel privileged to be a part. So we've had geological uncertainty, economic uncertainty, and spiritual uncertainty, and they all contribute to social uncertainty because they all have an impact on the social structures and systems which human beings create in our unceasing efforts to bring order into the chaos of our existence. Although latterly one could be forgiven for thinking that chaos seems to be gaining the upper hand. In quick succession in his article, Matheson names the Canterbury quakes, the Fukushima catastrophe, the collapse of supposedly reputable banking and financial institutions, the threat of financial and social ruin hanging over Greece, Italy, Ireland and Portugal, and the almost inconceivable statistic of 40% youth unemployment in Spain. Absent but implicit from this article, in the background, are the burgeoning ecological crisis, the impact on the world's political and economic systems of the effects of global warming, the growing numbers of people lacking access to adequate supplies of food and water, and of course the massive uncertainty about what is going to happen when our planet runs out of oil. After mentioning the momentous geopolitical shake-ups taking place within and among the Arab nations, Matheson states, a quite new world is emerging, as little forecast by all the high-paid experts as the financial collapse was. As one of his former students, the question that popped into my mind instantly was, what are the hallmarks of this emergent new world? Matheson writes of a virginal enthusiasm for democracy, ordinary men and women putting themselves on the line, defying the whole apparatus of fear, secret police, torture tanks. Stirring rhetoric, I thought. Although we might choose to use different words to describe it, I think it is possible to see signs of this emergent new world in a wide range of events reported in our media, from things like the miners' strike in South Africa to the deadly conflict that's recently claimed the lives of 5 Kiwi soldiers in Afghanistan. However, and with all due respect to my friend and former mentor, I suspect there will be a long and a very hard period of labour before anything resembling global democracy is born in our time. In the meantime, we're going to have to live with widespread social uncertainty, which will inevitably involve the ongoing breakdown of a whole host of political and social institutions. Now, we're probably all familiar with some of the sobering statistics that point to the size and scope of the challenges we're facing. Globally and locally, especially for our children, the world is becoming a more unsafe place. This document here spells a lot of this out in chilling detail, the 2012 report on the state of the world's children. This reveals that now more than 1 billion children live in urban areas, but owing to disparities within those areas, many lack access to healthcare, schools and sanitation and the basics of life. More and more children are growing up in less stable, less safe family environments. And even in this country that used to be known as God's own, there are, according to the Ministry of Social Development's 2005 report, 20 confirmed cases of child neglect and or abuse reported every day. Staggering stuff. In May 2009, the New Zealand Herald reported that according to analysis carried out by the NZ Department of Statistics, approximately 1/3 of New Zealand marriages are ending in divorce. Economic pressures are forcing parents, in many cases, to work longer hours, placing even more strains on family living. And as one who has actually worked in a community counselling centre, let me tell you, there are few experiences more tragic than meeting a parent who's worked him or herself to exhaustion in order to provide for a family and then had the devastating experience of the family itself falling apart. So much has changed in the lifetimes of what social historians have called the Generation X, which actually happens to be my generation. In this country alone, we have lived through the Think Big debacles, remember those? Anybody? We've lived through the Carless days, remember those? We've lived through the Muldoon era and survived that. We lived through the rise and fall of Rogernomics. We've lived through the proclamation of New Zealand's nuclear-free status, the privatisation and commercialisation of countless activities which during my childhood were the exclusive preserve of the state. Remember Cradle to the Grave? Where did that go? And on the global scene, the world we inhabit is very, very different. As an exchange student to Germany back in 1984, I clearly remember having to swap 25 West German marks for 25 East German marks, which I was then required to spend in the East before I crossed back over the border. Know where that is? Checkpoint Charlie. My kids have no idea what that even means. My children's world is one in which a few faded photographs in their parents' albums and a couple of panels in a museum somewhere are all that is left of the once infamous Berlin Wall. The Soviet Union's gone, and with it the spectre of the Cold War that haunted my childhood. And yet my children are growing up in a world that is, if anything, even more threatening and characterised by seemingly ever-increasing rates of change. Now, of course, it is a truism, an ancient truism, that change is the only real constant. But even a cursory glance at the newspapers and other media reveals that this reality does not sit too well with a larger proportion of our populace. In fact, denying change and resisting it when it happens seems to be the default setting for a significant number of groups and people in our world. Many of those groups and individuals ground their denial of and resistance to change in their belief in an unchanging deity and or a revealed system of doctrines and dogma. Whilst for others, of course, it's simply more convenient and more comfortable to do things as they've always been done and easier to pretend that things are still the way they've always been. Now, when that becomes impossible, as it has for us in Christchurch, when it becomes threatened, people understandably become fearful. And the fear of further change, further loss, tends to make human beings hold even more tightly to whatever tatters of the old symbolic certainties still remain. I think, personally, that is what's driving a lot of the people protesting against the Marriage Amendment Bill, many of whom seem not to have considered that the meaning of marriage has already been subject to tremendous change between cultures and over a long period of time. I think this particular placard sums that point up very, very memorably. Speaking of changes, and changes over time, I had an email just last week from somebody objecting to the recently released concept plan for our church's proposed rebuild, and you're going to be the first audience to receive some images of this made public today. That's what we hope to do with what remains of our church building, even though we plan to retain all the original interior woodwork and the panelling, which you can see from the next image. It's a nighttime shot. We're going to retain the same footprint, hopefully, the same profile within a contemporary framework. The correspondent who wrote to me was deeply distressed that Knox Church, Christchurch, would no longer look just as it did when it was built back in 1901. There's a postscript to that story. I sent a lengthy email explaining what we were going to do, and actually this person had seen reason, but it was quite an effort getting there. Every day on my way to work in Christchurch, I drive past placards demanding "Save the Cathedral." And with the greatest respect to everyone who has sacred memories attached to that iconic church building, as indeed I myself do, I find myself, when I see those placards, thinking perhaps it's time to let it go. I can't help thinking of one of the first things I noticed when I arrived in East Timor at the beginning of my 4-month tour of duty back in May 2001. And that was this monstrosity here, the crumbling walls of the Suai Cathedral. It was conceived, as you can see, on a truly massive scale. It was already partly built to accommodate large congregations from the Kovalima district, and the cathedral's construction then got halted after rampaging militiamen massacred some 200 local people, most of them on the grounds of the adjoining church, on the 6th of September 1999. I arrived there just 2 years after that. Some of those killed were gunned down as they sought shelter behind the cathedral's walls or tried to climb up the scaffolding. And part of my orientation tour was to see the bullet marks that were still in that building when we arrived. When I asked one of the Filipino missionary priests whom I befriended whether there were plans to repair the damage that time and the elements had created and complete this cathedral, he looked me in the eye and said, "Don't tell the bishop, but I sincerely hope not." I said, "Why not?" He said, "A building that looks like something out of Batman's Gotham City is not what these people need." As I got to know this man and witnessed his ministry, I could see why he made that statement. When I left East Timor at the end of August 2001, the construction of a large open-air community meeting house had just been completed on a site between the Ave Maria Church and that ruined cathedral. And I was privileged to witness the first gathering to take place on the site when the much-loved Bishop Bello, Nobel Prize laureate and tireless worker for the freedom of the East Timorese people, came to town. And these are some actual pictures of that event. Thousands, and I mean thousands of people lined the dusty roads. Children waved branches, women danced and chanted and beat drums to welcome him home. What was he there for? He was there to confirm several thousand young people who had over the preceding months taken part in what we might call inquirers classes or confirmation classes and had been pronounced by their catechists to be ready to make a public commitment to the Christian faith. Why am I telling you this story? Simply because it illustrates perfectly the first tentative answer I want to offer to the question with which we're grappling, and that's this. We can live with uncertainty by continuing to practice certain rituals that give our lives meaning and give our lives hope. Now, whilst the example I've chosen happens to come from a country in which many of those rituals are drawn from the Roman Catholic tradition, meaningful, life-affirming rituals are not the exclusive preserve of organised religion. And neither are they merely objects to be studied in somebody else's culture from a distance. Even in so-called secular Aotearoa New Zealand, rituals are vitally important in helping us to respond to uncertainties of various kinds. Let me offer you a concrete example. On the 10th of March 2011, I officiated at a wedding. And that's not particularly unusual. Ministers of religion are called upon to officiate at weddings all the time. But there were several things about this wedding that made it different and an occasion that I will always remember. The groom was the son of our congregation's much-loved organist, who of course lost his job when the September and February quakes made our organ unable to be played. The bride was Japanese. Her family lived north of Tokyo, and when news of the earthquakes and the tsunami that engulfed Sendai first reached New Zealand, there was a period of intense fear, anxiety, and then frenetic activity as they tried to locate members of the family and re-establish some form of communication with them. Once that happened, this young couple, in conjunction with their families, made what I think was a significant and very courageous decision. They decided to proceed with their wedding plans on the grounds that it becomes all the more important to affirm love and life in the face of death, destruction, tragedy, and loss. And I have seldom felt so emotional watching a bride and groom and their attendants make their way down the aisle of a church or any venue at the beginning of a marriage ceremony, knowing the chaos from which many of them had come just days previously in Japan, and with the memory still fresh in all of our minds of the chaos we'd experienced in Christchurch less than a month before. That wedding, and another at which I officiated on the first anniversary of the February quake, and also this event, a baptism we celebrated, when after nearly 3 months in exile, our congregation returned to Beeley Avenue for our first service in our new worship space at Knox Hall. And there's some other slides from that event. And then there's been also the funerals that other colleagues and I have conducted between aftershocks and all sorts of interesting venues. These rituals have acted like anchors amidst the shifting seas of uncertainty all around us. Or perhaps a better metaphor would be to describe them as rudders, helping to steer us towards an as yet unidentified shore. If rituals are rudders, then the ways in which people choose to gather socially are the boats, the waka, and these become especially significant in times of uncertainty and change. Our congregation's priority after the February quake was to get this building, the Knox Centre, green-stickered, as in the current parlance, you'll be familiar with it too, so that the Lifeline organisation which operates out of our venue could resume operation from that site. And since the coveted green sticker was granted in May 2011, we've had an estimated 5-fold increase in the number of groups and organisations using our meeting rooms, our chapel and remaining facilities on that site. For me, this experience provides the strongest possible evidence in support of what Sir Lloyd Gearing said earlier, that human beings are indeed social animals. With so much completely beyond our control, we nevertheless choose to spend time together, to gather together, affirming, as human beings have done for centuries, that amidst all the death and destruction and uncertainty around us, life itself can and does go on. But how? How does life go on? And what, if anything, can we be sure of? And crucially, what methods should we employ in managing change? Now, the first two of those questions remind me of something I must have heard about many, many years ago at high school, because that was the last time anyone tried to impart any kind of serious scientific knowledge to me. Apologies here to any theoretical physicists that may be in the congregation. As I understand it, as a non-scientist, whilst wrestling with the complexities of quantum theory in 1927, a young Werner Heisenberg asserted that the more precisely the position of a particle is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known in that instant, and vice versa. In other words, when dealing with the almost inconceivably precise calculations involved in research in the atomic and subatomic level, it's impossible to know for certain the position of a particle and its momentum at the same time. Now, whilst this has often been confused with the so-called observer effect, which posits that phenomena being observed are changed through the act of observation, the underlying logic of this principle, as originally applied to quantum physics, I think has obvious potential for application to the field of social sciences as well. And I was relieved to discover, whilst trawling through the internet to research this paper, somebody else agreed with me. No less a character than one Brian Frank, a Canadian information technology specialist and writer and part-time philosopher. And he wrote this: "As a very rough rule of thumb," he said, "I like to apply a kind of generalised version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The more precisely the position is determined, the less precisely the momentum is known, and conversely." Here's the bit that I want you to latch on to. Applied to social and economic models, replace momentum with any type of progress or change. The more statistically rigorously and thoroughly we think we know and understand a market or an organisation, the less we know about the human factors surging through it. When it comes to understanding the human side, the best instrument we have is human judgment and intuition. Ironically, how the mind works so well is itself subject to considerable uncertainty. And conversely, personal impressions and intuitions aren't enough either. We need hard facts to keep biases and errors in check. Yes, it's reductionist, and it would, I suspect, cause pure theoretical physicists to experience convulsions. And if you're in that category, please don't leave at this point in disgust. Because it does seem to me that in relation to the topic we're discussing, Mr. Frank's speculative musings communicate a very important truth. Given the scope and the magnitude of change that 21st century humanity is facing, being in a state of certainty about anything is increasingly unlikely. So balancing facts with intuition, learning to live with uncertainty, as the title of this lecture series implies, is actually one of the most sensible things we can do. And the next most sensible thing I think we can do is to address the third of the questions I asked earlier, namely, what methods should we employ in managing change? Now, to answer that, we need first to be clear about the kind of change that's called for. Social theorists commonly talk about two broad categories of change. Technical change, which usually involves tinkering with systems, structures and processes we've inherited, and adaptive change, which means creating new systems, new structures, new processes for situations we had not foreseen. According to a thought-provoking article I found in the Harvard Business Review, the single biggest failure of leadership is to treat adaptive challenges like technical problems. And if this is starting to sound a bit wordy and theoretical, I want to offer you a very pragmatic, real-life example which I think illustrates perfectly just what this means. You may have heard of the Stanaway family of Little. Anybody heard of the Stanaways up here? If you haven't, I'm going to inform you about them now. They've spent about $80,000 on geotechnical reports, architectural drawings and council fees for a modern building to replace their heritage home that was destroyed in the earthquakes. Here's a picture of what they would like to build. Having spent all that money, having gone through the process, they had their application for resource consent declined. Instead, they were told that the building should be replaced. Here's the old building, that's what they had on the site. That building should be replaced with something more sympathetic to the historic style of the town. Okay, work with me here. This despite the fact that almost without exception, every single building which once gave the town of Littleton its historic atmosphere and structure is now gone. And here's a picture of that building in the process of demolition. Here's a quote. The council is still rigidly following the rules despite the fact there are no historic buildings left in the main street, Anne Stanaway has been quoted as saying. The rules are broken. We need new rules. Simple as that. There is a good happy postscript to that story too. I understand that Mayor Parker is about to intervene, but it took a long time and a lot of money to get to that point. My point is that in times of social uncertainty, we need people courageous enough to make new rules and systems when it becomes patently clear that the old ones are broken and simply not working. We need to stop rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic and start looking out for icebergs whilst making safer, better equipped and maybe smaller boats. We also need, I think, to acknowledge and care for the people who are in the same boat with us. At times of social uncertainty, it becomes particularly important for people to trust their travelling companions, to feel that their concerns, when voiced, have been heard. And that, interestingly, was one of the main motivations behind a series of meetings held initially at Knox Church Centre, Christchurch, in our hall, to address the city's post-earthquake housing crisis. Interestingly, this is a crisis which, according to some official pronouncements, did not and still does not exist. Here's a slide of that initial meeting, held because Councillor Glenn Livingston and a number of other people actually knew that there were people, in fact, sleeping in cars, living in garages and stuck in quake-damaged houses. So they got a bunch of concerned groups and individuals together to brainstorm some possible solutions to what was going on. Now, that work is still ongoing. And whilst it's too soon to start speaking of a success story, my brief involvement with this undertaking brought home to me the fact that consultation is absolutely vital to managing uncertainty in a positive fashion when people are stressed and afraid. And yet consultation on its own is not sufficient. Consultation only counts if the information it generates is fed into a decision-making process that empowers the community as a whole. And I can tell you that's not always been the case in Canterbury over these last 2 years. Indeed, in our nation, one could probably say. Decision-making processes have not always been transparent, and people have become suspicious and distrustful and not always receptive to elected officials' pleas just to trust me. Not that simple. Times of social uncertainty have a way of calling forth new movements and new leaders, and they sometimes come into conflict with the old systems and rules. This fellow has become a national and international celebrity. It seems laughable now that the activities of Sam Johnson's Student Volunteer Army were almost shut down. They almost had to cease operating in the days following the September quake because of concerns about occupational health and safety. I kid you not. Thankfully, sanity, laced with a healthy dose of Kiwi pragmatism intervened. And pragmatism has also been to the fore in the ways in which many church groups and other not-for-profit organisations have responded to the earthquakes, with cooperation rather than competition becoming a recurring theme. We have the community of the St Luke's Church in Manchester Street meeting in our buildings, and at a practical level many congregations have shared space, shared mission operations into the most affected areas by the quake. Pragmatism and a carefully balanced mix of lateral and linear thinking also characterise one exciting way in which children, the younger generation, is now learning how to live with and respond to uncertainty. And that takes the form of this undertaking here. Who's familiar with that from children or grandchildren or young people? Yep, the Future Problem Solving program, which flourishes in a number of intermediate and secondary schools. Originally founded by Dr. Alice Paul Torrance, this paradigm involves identifying a future scene, which was originally called a fuzzy situation, so an uncertain future scenario, about which students are then required to identify potential challenges and problems, and then determine the most important problem before they write solutions to the problem, write criteria by which to judge the solutions, and then judge them according to the criteria they've generated by developing the highest scoring option into an action plan. I'm trying to condense a quite complex system into a couple of sentences, probably not very well. Does it work, is the question? Well, it works very well in my experience. I have a 12-year-old son who absolutely loves future problem solving. It certainly seems to have sparked an interest in him in topics about which I suspect at his age I was completely unaware. Their current topic, for example, is human rights. And as part of his preparation, my 12-year-old son Alex has been watching the TV documentary series Go Back to Where You Came From. Anybody seen that? Just imagine the impact of that series on a 12-year-old child. The series is about a group of ordinary, largely Caucasian Australians, some of them with some pretty heavy doses of prejudice, who are invited to experience for themselves what it actually means to live like a refugee, and charts their progress through that experience. My son's responses to this program and the participants' reaction to their surroundings has been really enlightening. And what I've learned from him of how future problem solving's structure operates makes me quite hopeful that it's helping to equip him and his generation, the generation after mine, to manage adaptive change in much more creative ways. It also intrigues me, another positive input here, that the strengths-based and resilience-building approaches to education and to therapy are being used increasingly with young people, which seems to imply that in an uncertain world, building character rather than simply amassing knowledge may be more useful in helping young people to do something worthwhile with their lives for their sake and the sake of the planet we pass on to them. And that brings me, you may be relieved to know, to my final question. What does living with uncertainty look like in practice? Oops. Not just in general, but in particular terms to people like you and me. I mentioned earlier my current research and study interests in the areas of psychology and counselling, and as luck would have it, in 2011 I decided to enrol in a paper entitled Acceptance and Commitment Therapy as part of a Master of Education degree. That decision turned out to be far more significant than I could ever possibly have imagined when I enrolled in it, because acceptance and commitment therapy is a behavioural therapy based on mindfulness, more commonly known by its acronym of ACT. Now, one of the underlying assumptions of this paradigm is that in any fully lived human life, pain and suffering of some form are going to be inevitable. And human beings tend to make that pain and suffering worse by struggling against things which are beyond our control. It makes sense when you think about it. So the first step in the simplified ACT process that I'm going to break down very, very simply for you today is logically acceptance. Opening up, making room for painful experiences and feelings, not pretending that we like them, because that would be absurd, but simply accepting them as they are, and also, crucially, acknowledging that there is more to us as human beings than the pain we currently feel. And you can imagine that when you're dealing with aftershocks, that cognitive leap becomes very important. There is more to me in the situation than the pain I am experiencing. It applies to lots of other situations as well. The second step in this process is choosing what we want to stand for. This comes back to Sir Lloyd's introduction and back to the crucial point of my lecture, really, that we need to choose what we want to stand for in life, and that means values. But ACT practitioners do not mean merely naming some abstract nouns that make us feel warm and fuzzy inside. Values are not a soft option. It means, in this process, and I submit for life in general, turning our values into verbs. The third step in the simplified acts process is therefore taking action, but not just any old action. Our actions need to be congruent with and driven by our values, or to express the same thing somewhat differently, we need to embody what we claim to believe. So, accepting our thoughts and feelings, being present, choosing a valued direction and taking action. That is, if you like, a very brief summary of ACT in a nutshell. But it's no exaggeration for me to say to you that it was this simple threefold paradigm and the mindfulness practices of breathing and managing one's breath that went with it, which more than anything else helped me personally to get through the months of often frenetic activity and stress that followed the February quake. And I've heard other counsellors and therapists and practitioners say very, very similar things. Grounding ourselves, mindfully being aware of what we want to stand for and taking actions, even tiny actions, congruent with those aims. It's probably the first academic course I've ever taken in which the course text forced me to drop my usual tendency to skim read and made me engage with it experientially. How many other skim readers are there in the audience today? Be honest. If you've ever done a university degree or two, you develop it to an art form, don't you? You've got to read this thing, it's got to get done. This course forced me to sit down, notice my breathing, notice my mental processes, and figure out what I wanted to stand for in the midst of a stressful, uncertain time. It made a difference to me. It made a difference to other friends that I know in Christchurch. And so here I am, more than a year later, remembering the last time I stood here to speak at St Andrews on the Terrace at a gathering to honour the gentleman who introduced me today in an era that we now call BCE, before the Canterbury earthquake. Some years ago, 2008 I think it was, when we celebrated the heresy trial, Sir Lloyd, it was a privilege to be here. And the afterword of a book that you've written since then are these words: in the 21st century, humanity must either take the necessary steps to become a mutually caring global community or bring about its own demise. A big claim in the afterword of a big book. Well, a small book actually, but a book with some very big, important ideas in it. And in similarly trenchant fashion, one of my other favourite philosophers, an Australian philosopher by the name of Michael Leunig, reminds us that there are two feelings. There are two languages, two activities, two motives, two procedures, two frameworks, two results: love and fear. So we have the requirement that we become a mutually caring global community. We have the reminder that there are these two paradigms, love and fear. That is simple. It may be called even simplistic, and yet it is quite simply appropriate, I think, to introduce the final thought I want to leave with you in my address today. And that's this: at times of social uncertainty, there are myriad reasons for human beings to be fearful. But history and common sense teach us that fear corrodes the very relationships on which our society's healthy existence depends. And so to live healthily with social uncertainty, we must acknowledge and accept the things that make us fearful, and then we must act with integrity, transparency and compassion. In other words, very simply, let's feel the fear and let's choose to act with love. Thank you.